you. Good morning. Very, very happy to be here. I'm going to take off my glasses. I can still see you well, but I can read better. Like Cooper said, we are seeing things we've never seen before. How new is this really, though? But, well, if we've never seen them before, there's hope. What I'm going to offer this morning is a story about the mental health system that's told through a kind of a dialectical timeline, a dialectic, something, something else. So I asked myself, what would it mean to trace a desirable evolution of the mental health system? I decided it meant the moments, like the policies, the ideas, the acts, the people, the institutions, the laws, that push the field toward greater user autonomy, user voice, greater transparency of power, less authoritarianism, less imposition from above, less coercion. And these moments feel like the system is moving in a humane direction. Yet each advance quickly is met by a counter force that resists, distorts, smothers that initial motion. This friction, liberation, then containment, critique answered by retrenchment, may be the system's actual mode of development. Not just things happening, but its very method of moving. So the point of my presentation is, what is this history, very briefly? And what does this history have to say to us now, in this time of events we've not seen before? So first, I'm going to go through every decade, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, in 17 minutes, 45 seconds. I'll do it. 1960s, Thomas Saw's Myth of Mental Illness, Irving Goffman's Asylums. They broke the spell of psychiatric authority. One unraveled mental illness as a metaphor. The other revealed the asylum as a total institution, a coercive bureaucracy, not a sanctuary. These were direct strikes on both the conceptual and the architectural infrastructure of psychiatry, the strongholds of psychiatry. And their reverberations stretch all the way to today, to why ICI is having its meeting, I think. So there's a chain there. At the same time, you had President Kennedy's 1963 Community Mental Health Centers Act. It actually carried the promise of localized, humane care for people who'd been confined in institutions most of their lives, and they could maybe live ordinary lives in the community. And then the countercurrent, the new psychopharmacology in the 50s and 60s, Thorazine, spearheaded by Thorazine, the most constraining drug imaginable, offered psychiatry fresh authority. Old institutions lost legitimacy, but chemical confinement, the chemical straitjacket, replaced the cloth straitjacket. Freedom from the state hospital morphed, as many people know here in this room, into dependence on medication. The CMHC systems, community mental health, completely underfunded from the start. Maybe half or a third of the institutions that were planned, these centers, were actually built. Overwhelmed, people drift into these single-room occupancy hotels, occupying blocks of city streets. That became community. 1970s, still opened up with a mood of insurgency. Ken Kesey's, remember, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, made psychiatry legible as social control, made madness just dissent. Mental Patients Liberation Movement, Judy Chamberlain, Howie the Harp, Leonard Frank. They articulated autonomy, self-help, peer control, peer governance, nothing about us without us. They did that long before it became a slogan. They were really acting on this. Big, this was big, never seen before. But that same decade saw the legitimization of psychiatric authority, because at the same time, while the books and the films were sort of glamorizing, revolt, every state was rewriting its civil commitment laws to directly allow the physicians to control that and decide on what terms they would incarcerate people on the basis of mental illness, in the name of mental illness. Psychiatric power was again directly tethered to the management and the detention of troublesome individuals. Liberation met risk management. And that radical critique of professional control, it just was transmuted into a sort of a professionalized advocacy sector. By the late 1970s, long ago already, government grants required these consumer, nonprofit partnerships with clinical providers and healthcare centers and hospitals, but all controlled by the healthcare establishment. 1980s, what happened? And I'm just picking among 100 events that I laid down first, just maybe a dozen. So there's so many other events we could mention. And I'm going to mention those, some of those in my critique of this presentation in a moment. But the 1980s started with some kind of recognition. People I trusted very much, Leonard Frank, Judy Chamberlain, told me the 1980s, those were great because Jimmy Carter had this Mental Health Systems Act that was passed in 1980. And that recognized officially was the most rights-based legislation ever about the mental health system, the Mental Health Systems Act. It offered the most rights-oriented federal kind of, architecture for spending on mental health. And then you had the Alternatives Conference. Maybe some of you were there. The one in 1984, it stood out as this milestone. User-run discourse everywhere, national recognition, NIMH recognition. People were elated. Think of all the lobbying, the contacts that took. Something unprecedented seemed to have opened, 1984, 40 years ago. Then the Reagan administration came in and reversed course with its fiscal conservatism. It repealed the Systems Act very quickly, and then it shifted to these block grants to states, which dismantled any kind of federal oversight, which is not necessarily in itself a good thing. And it reinstalled a kind of fragmentation, bureaucratically speaking, as the system's mode of continuing. Consumer language persisted, consumer language, but just without any resources that would make that rhetoric meaningful. Insurance utilization reviews reframed mental health primarily as a kind of a cost containment endeavor. It was a cost problem. Participation was through your consumption. You were a consumer. You consumed. That's how you participated. There was no participation without consumption. But the most consequential event was actually the most boring, the release of DSM-3, the most influential psychiatric text, most unassuming, very dry on its surface, but it buried all the earlier critiques with 120 new mental disorders still with us today. Nothing more influential than the DSM-3, 1980 it appeared. 1990s, some validation, finally. A wave of critical energy, Toxic Psychiatry by Peter Breggin, talking back to Prozac, Prozac backlash, the first RCT of antidepressant withdrawal, along with a bunch of whistleblowers, David Healy going into the drug company rooms, checking out all the boxes and looking inside the files. Peter Breggin, David Healy doing all that work. They publicly validated all the skepticism that had been voiced for now 30 years by critics, by users themselves, by consumers, by patients. That was validated. They exposed pharmaceutical deception like never before. You had to take it seriously. There were a few articles in the media, indeed. Yet the 1990s, that was also the era of DSM-4 and the decade of the brain, signed into act by President George H.W. Bush. Neuroscience was crowned the field's future. Brain-based framings would make stigma, whatever that was, disappear. Created a marketing bonanza. SSRIs were pushed into the culture with direct-to-consumer advertising. Ordinary sadness, shyness, everything was medicalized. Pharmaceutical companies funded family organizations, advocacy groups. They were expanding markets by the user activism, hugely expanding markets. Destigmatization then meant a pipeline straight to diagnosis and medication. That's the 1990s. 2000s. Well, that decade began with the second George Bush president establishing the New Freedom Commission, which elevated the recovery model to mental health policy, federal policy, peer specialists, choice-making, self-direction, adapted supports. At last, it seemed, the experiential dimension, the emancipation longed for, was being taken seriously. But that was swiftly absorbed into the machinery of evidence-based practice. Recovery was standardized with these fidelity metrics. Peer support became credentialed labor within clinical hierarchies, controlled by, of course, the top. Its radical potential was, domesticated. It was defanged. Very quickly, today as we speak, dozens of states are introducing laws specifying the required training, the promotion path for peer work. It's becoming not an alternative to anything, but just another component of the mental health workforce. 2010s. They also cracked open, the early 2010s, a number of new possibilities. Senator Chuck Grassley's investigations into big pharma funding of the American Psychiatric Association really shook the establishment for a few minutes. Alan Francis, the architect of the DSM-IV, he's a consummate insider. He led a revolt against the DSM-5. He publicly apologized himself for creating 3 childhood epidemics: ADHD, autism, juvenile bipolar disorder. He said, "I'm responsible and I'm sorry I did it. They were fake epidemics." Thomas Insel at the NIMH dismissed the DSM's categories as just mere patterns, not real medicine, in 2013. Finally, psychiatry was publicly questioning itself, mirroring the critiques of professionals and users. This was never seen before. But the dialectic, I guess, tightened again. Lived experience went viral. And with it came a wave of mental health awareness, branding. Corporations, celebrities, tech firms transformed critique into a market niche. Talk about it, supplant it, change it. Wellness became a commodity, a thing, and digital platforms began surveilling the silences during your phone calls or the slowness of your speech, surveilling your emotional states under the guise of care, looking for suicidal thinking maybe, an emergent regime of asymmetrical power, again, masquerading as empowerment. We're into the 2020s. It's too early. It's too early to say anything. But looking back, the whole day is to say something about it, and something important has been said a few minutes ago by Cooper here. But looking back across these decades, the friction is hard to miss. Sparks and initiatives that aim to expand autonomy, increase choice, shed light on power, dynamics, they're regularly met by these counter movements that smother, narrow, reframe, monetize, neutralize, or contain the reform or the intended reform. The system has a remarkable capacity to take any critical language or vision and to just make it part of its, managerial vocabulary. It has an amazing capacity to refurbish its power. It needs the critique. It feeds on it. It waits for it. And it recycles it pretty quickly. It grafts it into it just becomes another mechanism for its own stability. Now, I should acknowledge the limits of this sort of viewing, of course. That's my specialty. Acknowledge the limitations of the work you're doing. I'm highlighting event and counter-event, and I'm certainly or probably flattening so many local successes, stories, the honesty of the people that work within the system. I'm sure I'm doing that, who are trying to do better. And so maybe, not every reform is swallowed whole. Not every advance is undone. Maybe, or certainly. And I've omitted dozens of instances, small and large, on both sides of this dialectic that might offset it. It looks powerful, this thing, but it's not the only one. And I can't claim to fully map all the textures of the care, the connections that make up, present, that exist and are exemplified, I think, by probably 95% of the people present in this room. And so it's easy to minimize that alongside that big machinery of control that I'm talking about. Still, if we take that historical rhythm seriously, a difficult hypothesis emerges, and that is if reform within the existing mental health system routinely bends back toward familiar or newer forms of authority, if critique is repeatedly absorbed and swallowed and recycled, eaten up, then the changes that are most capable of shifting power have got to take place outside the system. Altogether. Does that mean rejecting, most institutions and the people that work in them? It's a question really worth considering. Even as we're reaching out to people. I personally have been reaching out to people, anywhere they are. But it certainly means also something else. It means cultivating forms of support and collaboration that are they're not going to be automatically rooted through the usual diagnoses and reimbursement structures and the clinical and professional hierarchies. And that sounds familiar to you, and these efforts exist. And again, Cooper mentioned the work of the online support groups trying to help people come off drugs, and the work that Laura Delano has done, and people who have I met who's doing this, Angie Peacock and Adele Framer, Sonia Styblo. These are people that I've met personally who are doing this. This is really, really interesting work. And why it's so interesting? Because it kind of, honors experience on its own terms. Your experience, because you say your experience. Let's hear about it. Here's my experience. Mutual aid is not professionalized. Relationships are not anchored in compliance. Where distress is interpreted for the distressed person, not, just by default pathologized or named, renamed. These efforts have existed for some time. They're modest. They're fragile. They're not immune to co-optation, by no means. But they do represent attempts to build support that doesn't immediately get pulled back into the orbit of the system. So reforming the mental health system might mean stepping outside it. And it might mean experimenting also at the boundaries, creating alternatives, but being really attentive to their vulnerabilities, engaging with institutions, but maybe not assuming that they can do more than they were designed to do, that they can bear more than they were designed to hold. That could be a bit too much hope there. And learning from history without expecting that it's going to repeat itself. So I'm not saying it's going to repeat itself. On the contrary, I'm saying we have choices, and I have 15 seconds left. So humility here again, maybe the most radical stance, which is the system's future will not be determined by logic or by critique or by policy design. It's going to depend on that interplay of people, of places, of practicing, this unpredictable interplay, not by any institutional forces. That is my understanding, despite the history I've told you, but I believe that history. It's not the only one, but I believe it. I believe this is how it has been happening. And what we have not seen before has been seen before. And we are here again. So if there's a path forward, I think it's going to lie in cultivating experiments. Like I remember, I'm got 1 minute left, really, but less. The Experimenting Society is a book about research methods written by Stanley, I forget his first name, Campbell, Donald Campbell, an experimenter, a specialist of research design, the Experimenting Society. And that's really what I have in mind when I'm saying this. You can look that up too and read it, very good book. And we need to cultivate experiments that are allowed, that allow care to grow where the system can't follow. That's, we really have to do that. And we have to be alert to be protecting and revising these experiments as they unfold. Thank you.